go. Okay, thank you, Peter. So let me begin by saying that this project is part of a long-term project I've been doing with Dr. Nike Pokorn of the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. And the project began when Dr. Pokorn came to Kent State several years ago on a Fulbright to study the Slovenian community in Cleveland, Ohio, which is actually near Kent, and it's where I live. And that is the largest population of Slovenes outside of Slovenia. So this says a little bit about the mass scale of the migration that was happening to the United States in the late 19th, early 20th century, in part encouraged by the US government to replenish a population that had been severely decimated by the Civil War. And so there were actually policies and land grants that encouraged this kind of migration. So it happened on an enormous scale. Then, of course, in the early 20th century, and especially after the First World War, we had a reaction against those immigrant communities, and we started to restrict immigration. This is when the concept of whiteness began to influence who was admitted, which immigrants were privileged and which weren't, which of course was informed by eugenics and all this other stuff. So that interwar period is hugely complex. It's one of the periods in US history that over the last several years has received the greatest degree of revisionist thinking, I think, and revisionist work by historians. And so we decided to focus our project specifically on that interwar period, but with the understanding that we have to go back a little earlier to understand where these communities are coming from. So I owe a great debt to Dr. Pokorn for bringing that community to my attention, and I began then to study the Russian diasporic community in the US, its newspapers, and so on. So you may have been struck by the fact that I use very intentionally this word diaspora. I recognize that there is an incredibly rich and growing literature on translation and migration, and yet I want to distinguish our work somewhat from that literature, and I think to address maybe a gap in that, again, very rich and very interesting literature. So, of course, I agree entirely with Loredana Polezzi, who argues that the context of migration represents a very important lens through which to study specifically the politics of translation. As she writes, for while the political nature of language is certainly not exclusive to migration scenarios, migration enhances its visibility, highlighting the interplay of linguistic choices which are variously permitted, frowned upon, singled out for praise, or simply barred. That being said, I feel that the migration literature often generalizes or abstracts the migrant or looks at the lens through the lens of an individual migrant experience, often ignoring the fact that most migrants either travel in communities or enter into already established immigrant communities, which may have their own institutions which sponsor translation and interpreting, right? So this is something that we wanted to focus on as we think a rather distinct site of translation and interpreting that has been, I think, largely ignored in the literature. And you see this kind of individual focus in Polezzi's discussion of, quote, the different positions occupied by migrants as agents or objects of translation and the sites where translation and self-translation take place, which focuses on the individual migrant as an artist or self-translator. And again, nothing that's very worthwhile approach, but we're just saying these communities have been largely ignored. And also these two publications display the same kind of individual focus on individual migrant experience. The literature on interpreting and migration, of course, is equally rich, and for obvious reasons tends to focus on the point before the migrant enters the host country, becomes part of that diasporic community. So there's wonderful literature, of course, on the asylum interview. These are just a few. Are people not seeing the slides? Peter, do you see my slides?
I see the slides perfectly well, but I have also read the notification by Meta, but it seems to be an idiosyncratic problem.
Okay.
So maybe we can just
So,
listen to what Brian says.
So again, I'm not, this is not pretending to be at all an extensive list of the literature on this topic. There's much, but here are just some key texts on asylum. Also, a lot of the literature focuses on state-sponsored interpreting, such as Brad Davidson's The Interpreter as Institutional Gatekeeper. Now, that being said, there is a growing literature on community interpreting, which, as the very name suggests, better captures some of the aspects that I will be addressing in terms of diaspora. That is the interpreting and translation that is sponsored by the diasporic community itself, as opposed to state-sponsored services. And you see this in the work, for example, of Rebecca Tipton, among others. I will also say that post-colonial literature on migration tends to use translation as a metaphor for all forms of cultural transfer. Again, this is a very rich, productive literature, but often elides the specific role of interlingual translation and interpreting in the lives of migrants. And I would argue that interlingual translation connects more directly to politics and issues of social justice, right? Who has access to these services, under what conditions, and so on, than the processes referenced by the metaphor of translation. So it's not, again, I don't want to present an either or, but I think even the metaphors of translation gets a certain, acquires a certain material reality when we also include interlingual translation. And so this focus on diaspora again, turns attention to those migrant communities which create and support institutions that produce and circulate translations, whether those be in the form of newspapers, journals, even publishing houses, right? And I think this also helps to expand our notion of migrant agency, right? So the individual migrant also often seems very much at the very vulnerable to the forces of the state and of international law. Whereas if we look at communities, we see that that was also a way for them to express agency in these situations. And also, as we would argue, these diasporic institutions represent distinct sites of interlingual translation that I think, or I will argue, fit uncomfortably within traditional nation-based frameworks and models. And again, they are sites at which the metaphor of translation intersects with the fact of translation. Now, I can't go on with theorizing diaspora without mentioning Maria Tomoshko's very influential article on the notion of in-betweenness in translation studies that appeared in the volume apropos of ideology, titled Ideology and the Position of the Translator. In what sense is a translator in between? So Tomoshko argues that in between mystifies the translator's position as a kind of, no place. And she situates the translator unequivocally within the target culture. So of course, this is perfectly viable if this is how we understand the in-between, right? Neither A nor B, somehow in this mystified no place, which is, again, theoretically unsound. Tomoshko's position, of course, may have been influenced by her positionality as a scholar working in the United States. She writes about being the child of immigrants from Slovakia. The assimilationist forces in the US are hugely powerful. There has never been until recently a push to allow immigrant communities or to encourage immigrant communities to preserve their languages and so on. And so it's been really either or in the United States. And I had many friends whose parents spoke another language at home and never thought of teaching that language to their children, because the message was you want them to assimilate, and this language somehow would have been a burden, would have prevented them from assimilating. So again, when we talk about how we move beyond either or thinking, this idea that yes, translation is a fact of the target culture, but is also a fact of the source culture insofar as translation changes the status of the source text and places it among other texts, perhaps as a work of world literature. Similarly, the traditional thinking about bilingualism has been very either or. that, you know, a second language actually impedes, or I'm sorry, a first language impedes the acquisition of a second language and so on. This was played out in Richard Rodriguez's very, I find, troubling memoir, Hunger of Freedom, where he is grateful to the nuns at his school who forced him and the other Mexican students to speak only English. Fine at school, but they also insisted that they speak only English at home. And so he talks about the fact that his parents, who had only rudimentary English, were trying to have conversations with the children in English, and basically an eerie silence reigned over their home. So again, more recent literature on cognition, brain function suggests this is not the case, right? The more languages you know, the more flexible your brain is, and so on. But for a long time, there was that thinking that learning the staying attached to your first language would prevent you from acquiring the second. And so Catherine Batchelor, I think, is very sensibly reimagines this in-between in the following way that appears in chapter 8 of her Decolonizing Translation. And my, excuse me, my work on diasporic communities suggests this is a viable model, that there is something, they often express both a either loyalty or some nostalgia for the source culture or the native land, as well as a desire to assimilate into the host culture. So it is very complex, and I do think this notion of in-between is viable. Again, especially coming out of what I've seen in studying immigrant communities in the US, and specifically immigrant newspapers. And of course, this also fits in well with Pym's notion of translators as cultural intermediaries, right? They had to get their knowledge of the second language somewhere, and that often belies attachments to another culture, whatever those form those attachments take. It also relates to Mary Louise Pratt's notion of contact zones, which she defines as social spaces where cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in context of highly asymmetrical relations of power. So again, what those two models, of course, don't show are those asymmetries. And of course, you also see this in the voices of migrants who say that one of the most salient aspects of the immigrant experience is that of being caught between languages. Ava Hoffman's memoir of being a young person speaking Polish and moving to Canada, she talks about those experiences. Also, we understand that these in this in-between of the diasporic community is also a place where hybrid formations occur. I don't want to idealize hybridity and fluidity, right, as sometimes is done in the post-colonial literature, but it is a fact that these hybrid formations occur. One especially kind of interesting example occurred in northeastern Pennsylvania around the town of Scranton, which was a mining town, a coal mining town that attracted huge waves of immigration from Central and Eastern Europe. And this population was referred to generally as hunkies. It was a derogatory term, and it came from Hungarian. You also saw them sometimes referred to as bohunks, which combined Bohemian with Hungarian. And although the surrounding Anglo population referred to them derogatorily as such, lumped them together, their interaction, their working together, and so on, led to the creation of a kind of local idiom, which seemed to have a East Slavic base, but then had a lot of words from Hungarian and West Slavic languages like Czech and Polish. And I was speaking to a young woman who was studying Russian, and her knowledge of this idiom helped, but it also presented some interference. And in any case, I was fascinated by it, and I finally said to her, well, what is this language called? I asked her in Russian, "Как называется этот язык?" And she answered without batting an eye, "По-нашему," our way. So something did occur there that wouldn't have occurred without that in-between space of this, in this case, multilingual diaspora. My theorizing diaspora also is greatly influenced by the chapter in James Clifford's Routes, Travel and Translation in the 20th Century, dedicated to diaspora. He basically does a really nice synthesis of the literature on diaspora, and he makes the point that diasporic practice cannot be reduced to epiphenomena of either the nation state or of global capital. So he argues it is something different, related to those things, but it is a distinct site of cultural formation, right? And the relationship of diasporic communities to the nation state can range from obviously hostile, resistant, to assimilationist, even patriotic, and everything in between. And of course, we also have to point out that diasporic communities themselves are not homogenous. They can be quite varied. And in fact, sometimes moving to the United States, where there was land available for them to settle, led communities to segregate themselves. So, for example, if in Bohemia you might have Catholics and Protestants living together in a single village or city, when they came to the United States, especially you see this in the states of North and South Dakota, they settled in what is often referred to as a checkerboard pattern, where you would have a Protestant community here, then a Catholic community there, and so on. So again, it's hard to resist this idea of preserving that native culture, because simply by setting up these new communities, they have changed it in different ways. And its development will be different. As Clifford goes on to say, whatever their ideologies of purity, diasporic cultural formations can never in practice be exclusively nationalist. They are deployed in translation networks built from multiple attachments, and they encode practices of accommodation with, as well as resistance to, host countries and their norms. It is different from travel, though it works through travel practices, in that it is not temporary. It involves dwelling, maintaining communities, having collective homes from home, and in this it is different from exile, with its frequently individualist focus. And again, I would say that individualist focus is also true of a lot of the migrant literature. So I'm looking, as Clifford, at these communities and the cultural work they do, and specifically the cultural work of translation within these diasporic communities. And as he goes on to say, diaspora discourse articulates or bends together both roots and routes to construct what Gilroy describes as alternative public spheres, forms of community, consciousness, and solidarity that maintain identifications outside the national time space in order to live inside with a difference. And elsewhere, he describes it as dwelling in dislocation. But again, I would stress that these communities themselves are not homogeneous, and also that they change over time in different ways. So every diasporic community has its own history. So for example, when we were comparing the Slovene experience to the Russian experience, the Slovenes in the US had a huge influx of migration in the late 19th, early 20th century that then dried up. And so you saw that where early translations tended to be from English to Slovene, later translations served a population that was losing the Slovene language. And so you saw then translations from Slovene into English for those grandchildren of the original immigrants and so on. So every diaspora community will have a somewhat different relation to translation. I should also mention another interesting use of in-betweenness. So we should also say that there are a number of ways you can be in between in the historical literature on immigrant communities in the US. A really fascinating work by Peter G. Vellon called A Great Conspiracy Against Our Race, Italian Immigrant Newspapers and the Construction of Whiteness in the Early 20th Century. He argues that because Italians and the Irish, in fact, were often discriminated against in ways very similar to people of color in the United States. You would see signs on doors, no colored, no Irish, no Italian, things like this. And that following the First World War, with the emergence of whiteness, it allowed the Italians kind of to argue for a change in status. So as Velen writes, along with historians such as Robert Orsi, John Higham, David Rodinger, and others, I believe the term in-between most accurately describes the racial position in which European immigrants found themselves as they learned and negotiated the American racial landscape. Writing in particular about Southern Italian immigrants in East Harlem, Orsi provide instrumental in establishing the notion of in-betweenness and the effort to establish a border between oneself and those perceived as the darker other, right? So these Southern Italians especially had to negotiate the racial lines in the United States in different ways, and did that, among other places, in their newspapers. And so why study specifically immigrant newspapers? As Gensler notes, and especially I'm talking about the US context, but when we did a panel at the last S conference in South Africa on this, there was a fascinating talk by a Finnish professor about bilingual Russian-Finnish journals that were supported by the Russian diaspora there. So again, this doesn't apply, I think, only to the US, but as Edwin Gensler notes, the hundreds, even thousands of small papers and magazines in 19th century America, all publishing in multiple languages and translating both from the foreign English language into their own and translating their own stories for publication in English journals. I mean, the size alone, the scope warrants their study, I believe. And what's interesting is during the Depression, when Franklin Roosevelt created these government-sponsored programs, one of the programs studied immigrant communities and studied in particular their newspapers. And so we're able to document the enormous number of immigrant newspapers. In fact, there were newspapers in 23 foreign languages in the city of Chicago alone between 1855 and 1938. Moreover, as I said, we can't treat these diasporic communities as some kind of homogenous identity. Once arriving in the United States and having either land or resources, they often split into various subgroups. And so many immigrant communities supported several newspapers defined by different, often competing political and regional affiliations, as documented in the 1942 report by the Chicago Library Omnibus Project, which was funded by the WPA, that studied foreign language newspapers in the city of Chicago. And that study documented 207 Czech language newspapers and periodicals published in Chicago since 1855, representing a broad range of political, cultural orientation, ranging from conservative Catholic to radical leftist. And until recently, these newspapers were largely ignored by US historians, as noted in that WPA-sponsored study. They say in the introduction, the foreign language press is in large part a closed book to the American scholars who are otherwise best prepared to study it, because no one can make a comprehensive study of it, comparing group to group, without an extraordinary command of foreign languages. So again, they've been ignored by Anglophone American historians, and I think this is also a call for translation studies scholars to look at these periodicals. And of course, the significance of immigrant newspapers to the US experience has been acknowledged by many historians now, but little scholarly attention has been paid to the specific role of translation in those, I would say, privileged diasporic venues. Scholars in the field of translation studies, on the other hand, have over the last 15 years produced a significant body of literature on the role of translation in mass media venues. Again, a rich and expanding literature, but immigrant newspapers have been largely ignored. The focus has been obviously national, international newspapers, but these specific immigrant newspapers haven't had a lot of attention. So a comparative study of immigrant newspapers can highlight the distinct nature of each community, as I said, both synchronically at any one time, comparing, let's say, the Russians, Slovenians, the Chinese, for example, but over time as well. And as I mentioned, the Russian community had a constant influx of immigrants over the course of the 20th century, which kept Russian language newspapers alive. Whereas the Slovenian newspapers, where they do still exist, are almost exclusively in English. You will see there are still two Slovenian churches in Cleveland. One says Mass in Slovenian still, the other in English. So you see also different assimilationist tendencies. And so if we situate immigrant newspapers within the context of diaspora, I think by their very nature as representations of minority communities, right? Immigrant newspapers have a dual orientation. This comes out again and again in the literature on immigrant newspapers, toward a home that has been lost and to a place that is not yet home. But again, how they negotiate that in between this is quite distinct in the different newspapers. You will see some newspapers encouraging their what we call today consumer citizenship. You know, you should buy a home, and then they'll give directions on how to do that. Buy a car, things like this. Other newspapers will encourage education as a way to assimilate, whereas also encouraging people to remain interested and attached to their home country. So as Gensler notes, translation within diasporic communities is deeply implicated in identity formations as members negotiate their position as a distinct but still constituent part of the larger culture. Right, and as that WPA report says, the foreign language press contains part of the priceless record of the process of assimilation. They perhaps place the emphasis on assimilation because during this period, in the run-up to the Second World War, they were also seen as a site of potential sedition. So that they were also sites of resistance, which isn't, of course, mentioned in this government-sponsored report. So as Louis Hemmerling states in the inaugural issue of the American Leader, which was the official journal of the American Association of Foreign Language Newspapers. So you get some idea of how many there were if they could form their own self-sustaining organization. It was founded in 1908, and already by 1912, it could boast a membership of over 500 newspapers in 29 languages. Right, so again, this idea of and I think this was one of the main purposes of Gensler's book on translation in the Americas, was to, decenter this notion of a monolingual America. That monolingualism has been constructed, and as I tried to argue in my last lecture, constructed through anthologies, through literary histories, and so on. But this was not the reality, and you see it best captured in these more ephemeral cultural products such as newspapers. But as he writes in his introduction, the American Leader is to serve two great purposes: to lead the foreign-speaking millions towards still more thorough American citizenship, right, assimilation, and to give American people clearer ideas of this great populace of foreign-speaking people, which forms now such a great portion of our population. Now, this is a kind of glory age, because with the First World War comes a lot of xenophobia, especially the enormous, remember the German minority was the largest in the United States in the 19th century. And so during the First World War, they came under enormous suspicion. So the relationship of the dominant culture to these foreign language newspapers is also complex and multi-pronged. At times, the newspapers were seen by the US government as useful vehicles for disseminating civic information to non-English speakers, and so they provided translations and disseminated them to the newspapers. At other times, however, the government treated these newspapers as sites of potential sedition, and the way they surveilled them was often by demanding translations. So we also see an interesting use of translation here, which was surprising to me. I've studied translation and censorship, especially in the context of Russia and the Soviet Union, but this was a little different to see how translation was used as a means of surveillance in a way. I'll talk about that in a minute. So situating again immigrant newspapers in that interwar period, as I mentioned, the late 19th century saw an enormous immigration into the United States from many parts of Europe, but also from China and other parts of Asia. As this report notes, in the late 1800s, people in many parts of the world decided to leave their homes and immigrate to the United States, fleeing crop failure, land and job shortages, rising taxes and famine. Many came to the US because it was perceived as the land of economic opportunity. And these were, in fact, enormous, for the great part, what we call economic migrants. Others came seeking personal freedom or relief from political and religious persecution, and nearly 12 million immigrants arrived in the United States between 1870 and 1900. During the 1870s and 1880s, the vast majority of these people were from Germany, Ireland, and England, the principal sources of immigration before the Civil War. Even so, a relatively large group of Chinese immigrated to the US between the start of the California gold rush in 1849 and 1882, when federal law stopped their immigration. So again, we see here where racial-based immigration laws started to appear during this period. So when Donald Trump said, if you may remember, to the Norwegian ambassador, oh, why don't more Norwegians settle in the United States? I mean, this is a long history of race-based immigration that started in the late 19th century, but really accelerated in that interwar period. Again, fueled by eugenics and a lot of those other things that would really come to a head, of course, in the Second World War. And so the US government, after the decimation of the population in the Civil War, passed the Homestead Act. Actually, this is during the Civil War. It was a land law used by the 37th Congress of the US to distribute the available public lands to private individuals. Of course, public lands, these were lands confiscated from the indigenous peoples. However, it went beyond the distribution of land and became the United States' first accommodating immigration law, providing all necessary requirements for citizenship. Examining congressional debates in the language of the Homestead Act, it is apparent the 37th Congress saw the Homestead Act as a way to build an agricultural nation by encouraging immigrants to settle the public lands of the United States. And again, this use of public lands is problematic, as these were lands, of course, settled or taken from the indigenous population. But this is on the National Park Service of the US website. But again, they were encouraged in the late 19th century, but then in the early 20th century, there was already a backlash forming. And one of the ways, or one of the forms that backlash took, was against this idea of a multilingual America. And this is a statement that astonished me by former US President Theodore Roosevelt in 1919. It was just a few weeks before he passed away in that year. He said, "We have room for but one language here, and that is the English language. For we intend to see that the crucible turns our people out as Americans, of American nationality, and not as dwellers in a polyglot boarding house." All right, and so we see this consolidation of English, of whiteness, and so on in this, specifically in this interwar period, following those massive waves of immigration. And so unlike other multilingual polities, such as the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was documented beautifully by Michaela Wolff, the United States, for the most part, adopted a policy of non-translation. Right, so this idea we don't even need to declare English as our national language, it just is naturally that. But of course, it happened by a variety of means. In any case, we also see that reflected, as I said, in the absence of translation in anthologies of US literature. And so at this time in the late 19th, early 20th century, you saw kind of two competing approaches to dealing with multilingualism. One was the rise of what we call local color literature, which presented non-English speakers, especially people who didn't speak standard English, as quaint, as belonging to an agrarian past, etc. But it was also occurred side by side with the violent repression of non-English speech. So in terms of the local colors stories, there's a lot of literature about that, and they explain that in the aftermath of the Civil War, local color stories provided middle-class white readers with, quote, consuming images of rural others that worked as both a nostalgic point of origin and a measure of cosmopolitan development, right? So look how far we've come. We're educated now. We speak a standard language, but they can find these local color stories as quaint remnants of another time. Local color literature paradoxically contributed to the consolidation of the monolingual nation, incorporating non-standard versions of English within the American national imaginary to conjure, again, nostalgic visions of a peaceful agrarian past. But of course, those vernacular languages were often embedded within a narrative or a narration that was presented in standard English, right? So framing them as local, right? So they construed the vernacular as minor, substandard, a remnant of the past, often spoken by racialized characters. But of course, alongside that kind of charming presentation of multilingualism, we had the violent denigration of non-English speakers and their exclusion from public life, which continues to this day. As Gensler notes, slaves who spoke their own language or who refused to speak English were harassed, beaten, incarcerated, tarred and feathered, sold, or in some cases had their tongues cut out. In areas such as Louisiana, French, Cajun, and Creole patois were officially eliminated from the public sphere, while their speakers were indirectly discriminated against in private society. Again, so there was this multilingualism in this time was seen as an increasing threat to America. So again, the problems we're having today have a very, very long history. They don't come out of nowhere. They have a very long history, and much of it happened in this interwar period. So as Louis Adamic, a Slovene, a very important Slovene immigrant in the United States, he was a writer, journalist, publisher. He wrote in his memoir, My America, riding in streetcars, subways, and elevated trains, old stock Americans, as well as Americans whose background in the United States is a matter of but 3 or 4 generations, are wont to feel vaguely uneasy when they see a person next to them reading any of the 1,076 foreign language newspapers and magazines which are published in the country in 38 different languages. They are wont to give the reader of such a publication a suspicious glance. So that leads me to this idea of translation as surveillance in this interwar period that came out of the Trading with the Enemy Act that was passed on October 16th of 1917, right, as a result of the First World War. It required what they called true, I assume accurate translations of articles taken from the foreign press and published in US-based periodicals to be submitted to the US Post Office. So Trading with the Enemy Act, the trading here is important because anything that crosses state lines can be regulated by the federal government. And that's what they said. Many of these newspapers were sent by the US mail. And so this was a law that was enforced by the post office. So in 1921, the US government censored the Russian immigrant newspaper Novaya Ruskaya Slova that I was studying under this law. And it was announced on the front page of the paper with the headline, Novaya Ruskaya Slova vzята pod cenzura. We have been subjected to censorship. And here is the actual. You also notice Russian speakers may notice, I think maybe they've already switched to the new orthography here. But in any case, many of the immigrant newspapers in situations like this maintain the old orthography, which the Bolsheviks reformed very early on, and so they again, is another sign of the distinct nature of these immigrant diasporic communities. It was evident in the very orthography that they used. So this period also saw the publication of the first scholarly study of the immigrant press in the US, Robert Park's The Immigrant Press and Its Control. So the idea that we need to surveil this, but he actually took a very liberal, tolerant stance, and he mentioned a proposal to require an interlinear translation of all foreign language newspapers, but argued against that this kind of what he called coercive Americanization doesn't work. Instead, the press should be used in a quote unquote cooperative manner. And of course, the interwar period comes to an end with World War II, which altered the Roosevelt administration's largely benign relationship to immigrant newspapers. So the Roosevelt administration was using those newspapers to circulate information for non-English speakers. They often provided the translations. But again, as the Second World War, as it comes on the horizon, once again, these immigrant communities are seen as potential sites of sedition, which of course resulted in the incredible creation of camps for Japanese Americans. It also brought new surveillance to foreign language newspapers. As Takeya Mitsuno writes, after Pearl Harbor, as the public climate turned sour against the people of Japanese descent, the Roosevelt administration faced a difficult question of how to treat the Japanese enemy language newspapers within its borders. While the military-led alarmist exclusionist group of officials demanded to suppress them all, the civilian-led liberal pragmatic group insisted on preserving and utilizing them for national war policies. Their political tug-of-war ended in favor of the latter group, meaning that the Japanese language press would be immune from total suppression or censorship throughout the war, which is fascinating. I mean, if you think that actual Japanese were placed in camps, but the newspapers were allowed to continue because they thought they might be of some use in disseminating information. So very quickly, to end, what are some of the issues that come up when studying immigrant newspapers? And so let me just mention quickly, there are issues of visibility, directionality, and patronage or sponsorship. So in terms of visibility, again, much of this is covered in the general literature on translation in newspapers, the idea that news stories are written from a variety of sources, and perhaps in international newspapers from a variety of multilingual sources and so on. So we don't know to what extent they're translations, etc. But it's a little different here in that translations that are taken are often not labeled as translations. So they are completely covert. They are also sometimes semi-covert, in the sense that they are not marked as translation, but they reveal themselves to be translations, such as an interview published in a foreign language with a US senator who doesn't know that language. I found several of these in the Russian Novaya Ruska Slova. It was clear the senator did not know Russian, so these were translations, but they weren't marked as such. And then, of course, overt translations that in which the status of these texts as translation is marked. These are actually the minority. Many of them are covert. And so we have to ask questions, does the newspaper hide what it borrows, or does it purposely signal that borrowing? Is this different across newspapers? What can this tell us about the immigrant community's perception of the dominant culture, about surveillance, right, and its political and cultural authority? Directionality in these newspapers, as I said, is quite interesting too, because the directionality of translation flows again, refers to the relationship between the two languages involved, the source language, the target language, the host language, the native language, and so on. And what can that directionality of translation flows tell us about the relationship between source and target language in the specific context of diaspora? And I mentioned this already with the Slovene newspaper, because they had a huge influx of immigrants in the late 19th century that petered out in the 20th. People stopped knowing the language, and so the directionality of the translations at a certain point begins to shift, and they're including translations of Slovene literature and articles into English for a now monolingual English readership. as I said, this is my point here, the immigrant audience for these newspapers is diversified diachronically. Again, in the case where you don't have a constant influx of new speakers of the language. Again, and the combination of translated and non-translated texts appearing side by side is often a common feature of immigrant newspapers, although not all immigrant newspapers approach translation in this way. So the Slovene was very common to see both English and translations original Slovene texts and translations side by side. In the Russian Nove Ruske Slovo, this was rare. And finally, patronage. It's important to ask whether these newspapers are sponsored from within the diasporic community, and if so, by what organization? Is it by the local Catholic Church? Is it by a workers' organization and so on? Or from without, by the government, for the government, or from without, from non-government agents, so from foreign governments? Sometimes there would be support for these publishing ventures, especially book publishing ventures, from the source, the native country. So, for example, we see that today with the Russian government funding translations of Russian literature into a number of languages. And then again, translation from within often includes information useful for members of the community. It's also a vehicle for appropriating cultural capital. The Slovenian newspaper Prosveta published the first Slovenian translation ever of Oscar Wilde. They also published the first, probably not the first, but Slovenian translations of Mark Twain. Again, obviously the relevance of American authors to the Slovene readers who now lived in America. Translation from without involves government-sponsored translation, that is civic information for immigrants, and government-mandated translation for surveillance and other purposes. So two quite different purposes for that government-sponsored translation. Again, we see a more benign approach to translation in those WPA-sponsored programs. So those are the Roosevelt government-sponsored work programs during the Depression. And in the early 1940s, the WPA undertook a comprehensive study of these immigrant newspapers in Chicago. It was known as the Foreign Language Press Survey, and it hired writers and sociologists to translate and classify selected news articles. So the very study of the newspapers involved translation, their translation for by the government-sponsored organization. So I thought that was an interesting site of translation as well. And again, the authors justify this study in the introduction to their final report. In the writing of American history, it has been recently recognized that not enough emphasis has been given to the many foreign-born groups who have helped to build this country. Although this neglect has been repaired to some extent in late years, the study of immigrant life in the United States remains largely an untilled field. I will argue that that, in fact, remains the case today. We've still done a lot of work, but there is so much that needs to be done, especially in reference to these newspapers. I will say the National Endowment for the Humanities has been able to digitize an enormous number of these newspapers. So now they are available for research in a way they haven't been in the past. Because I was looking at crumbling copies of this Nove Ruske Slovo, and so I'm very pleased that many of these are now available. If you look at the National Endowment of Humanities, you search there, you can find it's an open database, so it's very valuable. Also, we see that when the government pulls back and no longer is supporting these newspapers as a site for disseminating civic information, you do see NGOs step up, such as the Foreign Language Service, which was originally a federal government agency, but it then became an NGO, and they started to fill the gap in providing immigrant newspapers with information. And crucial in that move was an individual, Josephine Roche, who basically transformed this foreign language information service into a voluntary organization that took a very positive approach to the immigrant newspapers, seeing them as a venue for the dissemination of useful civic information and for the promotion of civic engagement. There would be things, how to vote, why you should vote, and so on. And translation was in fact central to this organization's work, with the service, quote, routinely translating press releases from federal agencies and sending them to 850 newspapers and 67,000 foreign language organizations and their branches. So the extent, the scale of their work as a non-government organization was really breathtaking at a time when the government was pulling back. And finally, I'll add, advertisers also encouraged translation for these diasporic communities. There was an interesting article I found in 1922 from the Fourth Estate, a weekly newspaper for advertisers and what they called newspaper makers, which read 12 millions read papers of alien tongues. And they encouraged the business community to produce advertising in foreign languages for these immigrant audiences. All right, so again, this was a very broad view, but my major argument was that immigrant communities and their institutions, such as newspapers, but also publishing houses and so on, represent distinct context zones or sites of translation that deserve further study. So I hope we can in the future expand the literature on immigrant newspapers to include translation, expand the literature on translation in newspapers to include immigrant newspapers, and finally to expand the literature on translation and migration to include immigrant communities. And I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your inspiring lecture, Brian. You can now stop sharing your screen because I have this echo again.
Mm-hmm.
So I see that we have one question, at least one question. Luc van Doorselaar is raising his hand, as well as I cannot see who's raising the other hand. Irmak. So maybe first, if I'm not mistaken, maybe first, Luc, go ahead.
I should say I'm not surprised Luke has a question about newspapers.
I didn't want to surprise you, Brian. Good morning. Irmak has already asked several questions 2 days ago, so it's up to me now. Yeah, thanks a lot for another great talk. We're getting used to that, by the way. And of course, I was very much aware of your fascinating work with Nikkei. And you may remember a couple of years ago, I was in touch with Nikkei, I think with you as well, because I had an MA student working on, well, at that moment, only remaining Dutch language Flemish newspaper in the States, which was called the Gazette of Detroit. Well, actually in Dutch, the Gazette van Detroit. And the interesting thing, it was a student in journalism, but we tried to focus on translation as well, which was not too easy because he got in touch with the editors. They were all, well, the remaining editors there were all over 70, if not over 80 at that moment. And there was hardly any knowledge of Dutch left. At that moment, it was also published online, and that newspaper was mainly in English. It confirmed more or less what you said, with now and then an article still in Dutch. And then it existed for 105 years, and it stopped existing actually 3 years ago, I think. The last years, and that's also the patronage you were talking about, it was funded by the Flemish government as a kind of, I would almost say, a folkloristic experiment or phenomenon. Yeah, it was not more than that. So, and that's what my question is about. So in general, you talked about diachronic research and synchronic research. From a diachronic point of view, would you say that in general, it's always like that? They are more or less dying out. We start with a more or less monolingual situation of the immigrant language. Then we go to the situation of in-betweenness, one could say now, where it is bilingualism. And then in the end, there is full assimilation, monolingual situation of the local language. That's how it has happened up to now. I'm not sure it will be different now. I know that, for instance, the Polish community in Antwerp, here where I am now, also has a newspaper, still printed newspaper, twice a month, I think. But nowadays it seems to be more easy to, well, continue living in that own language, not necessarily transferring to the local language. Did you see that kind of phenomenon as well in your research?
Yes, and again, a lot of it depends on the immigration flows. So when they die out, of course, the language dies out, and you see only token instances of the native language. I also saw with the Russian newspaper, you see a radical transformation of the politics of the newspaper with each Russian wave of immigration, because of course those waves were quite different. Each had its own politics. So it was a newspaper founded before the revolution. It was quite radical, a workers' newspaper. And so you see in the announcement in the newspaper that it was censored as what they said, radikalna gazeta, as a radical newspaper. But of course, with this enormous influx of first wave immigrants, which were, bourgeois and noble people and stuff, it became quite conservative in many ways. It became more religious. And then later with the third wave immigrants, which were largely Jewish, highly educated, secular Jews, but from the large cities, its politics changed again. Although I shouldn't say it changed uniformly. You saw a kind of a mixture of voices and things, and they become more complex, maybe politically. So yeah, but each one, I think, has its own historical trajectory. I would love to see someone do something on the Chinese newspapers, because there were many, and they still exist today. And I would like to see how those compare with, of course, the Russian, the Slovene, when you have a minor languages versus larger languages and things. But yeah, I think there's tons of work to be done. I could only scratch the surface here, I'm afraid.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much for this question, Luc. So you are referring to the Polish community in Antwerp. I have also the impression that the ability of preserving the mastery of a language, the command of a language, depends on the motivation of the community to keep this alive. And in the case of the Polish community in Belgium and abroad, they organize these Sunday schools for their children. And I have the impression that many Polish immigrants send the children to the Sunday schools, whereas in the Russian communities, Russian-speaking communities, you cannot find this motivation anymore. And then they're more quickly losing it, and then you get this full assimilation. That's
right.
just
but Peter, yes, that also speaks to the importance of these diasporic institutions. So, for example, the first wave immigrants after the revolution, they were very good at preserving the language because they did it, as you say, through the churches. So in graduate school, I sang in a Russian choir, and we used to perform at many of these places. And we went to a church in New Jersey, and many of the great-grandchildren still spoke Russian. They learned it in their Sunday schools and things. And of course, there on the wall in the church hall was a portrait of the last Tsar and things like that. But again, the local institutions will determine that in many ways. But I'd like to also compare that with the case of Australia, where there's a lot of government funding for these immigrant communities to preserve languages and stuff. So again, I don't want to pretend that the US situation is in any way, the only way this could happen.
I do have the impression that it is changing nowadays. I'm an immigrant myself nowadays, working in Estonia, and I couldn't have imagined when I left that even after 3 or 4 years there, I still don't know Estonian, and I don't need it. I function in English and German over there, and I follow the news in Dutch. So it's perfectly possible to do that even without a Dutch language community there. So internet is changing things as well, depending on the professional situation.
Okay, many thanks. So Irmak, do you still have a question?
Do, if we have time.
Yeah, we have. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So my question is about the positioning of the translator. In the beginning of your talk, you were mentioning Bachelor and Timochko, for example, in Bachelor's paper, she suggests that the translator stands at the union of the source culture and target culture, and Timochko suggests that the position of the translator is rather towards the target culture. So I was wondering if exophonic literature be researched through the scope of diaspora and translation, and can we position the translator, who is the self in this case, as somewhere different than these two options? Do you think exophonic literature could be an exception?
Yeah, that's a great idea, and I do think there's more work to be done on theorizing these this space, because of course the contact often, the assumption is that it's one literature meeting another one, or one language meeting another one, when in fact any immigrant culture will also be well, this goes back to Luckelsmith of the semiosphere. It involves all cultures that are part of right, that they know or that they're interested in knowing. It's never a one to one. So yeah, I mean, yes, and I mean, maybe the two circles are already leading us or keeping us within this binary thinking, and how we might more complicate that. But yes, that's a good way to start, is looking at that exophonic literature. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Irma. Any more questions or comments? You can raise your hand or just take the floor. Christina? You should open your mic, because I see your lips are moving, but we didn't.
Sorry, sorry. Yes, this I was saying it was more a comment than a question, really. But it made me think of the Italian diaspora in Argentina and how huge that was. And I have this very wonderful anecdote of the writer Hector Bianciotti, whose parents came from Piedmont, and they settled down. He was born there, and his parents never wanted him to speak their dialect, their Italian dialect, and they forced him to just speak Spanish. And the interesting thing is that he only got to started writing when he moved to France, when he learned French, which is very near to the Piedmont dialect. And so he kind of found a way back to his hometown. So that's also another way that diaspora works.
Yeah, and those journeys are so idiosyncratic, right? That every individual, in a sense, finds their own accommodation or negotiates that relationship. Yeah, that's a great story.
Okay, thank you for sharing this, Christina. Anthony Pym?
Right, got it. Thanks for the great talk, Brian. I'm interested in comparing your studies to a study that Nuni Ayvazyan and I did on the Russian-speaking community south of Tarragona, right next to where I used to live. And it occurs to me that the contemporary diasporic community is incredibly different. We don't find any print work in Russian. We do find lots of translating, but related to commercial aspects and money laundering and weird things like that. But what is interesting is that only part of the community is there on a permanent basis. We have the business people who are traveling in and out. We have grandmothers who come in for the summer holidays and go back to Russia. Lots of mobility around the community. And so maintaining the language is incredibly difficult. And if I compare it with the similar communities in Australia, the big difference is that here in Australia, the non-English language can be taught in local schools. It's constitutionally correct to do so in public schools, in state schools, that is, whereas in Spain that is impossible. If we offered Russian, it would have to be available to everybody. It's not possible to offer it for one particular community, like in Arizona and California. with the laws in the United States. So I think there's a legal problem with maintaining languages in some of our countries. And the translation aspect is there. A lot of translating happens, but it's somehow no longer related to the maintenance of the community or the maintenance of the language. I'd be interested to have your comments.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the internet has changed a lot, and this Nove Ruska Slovo, which was a vibrant and very large circulation paper, disappeared. A few years ago it was closed. So yeah, these are interesting remnants. I also think, the newspapers might be best studied to among a variety of institutions. I'm interested in immigrant-run publishing houses too, and the image. Who are they directed toward, and is it toward the larger community to give them an impression of the immigrant culture? Is it to their own people, etc.? So, but I've always been impressed by the Australian situation, which I think is rather unique. And I had a good Croatian friend who was, was able to study Croatian. He was of Croatian background, and this is part of his academic work, and he was able to study it in government-sponsored translation. So I think that's unique. I don't know how common that is, but certainly it's not what was done in the States. And as I said, already in the early 20th century, you started to get this backlash against multilingualism. Yeah. So, but again, I think you're right. You have to take all of that into account. But I like Clifford's notion of dwelling in displacement, which I think, works actually very well for communities like the one you're describing, Anthony, where people are coming and going and, yeah. So it's maybe we have to also alter our understanding of how fixed that movement is, right? Because there is much more mobility now. Yeah.
If I might add, to study the Chinese community in Melbourne, my colleague Bae, who's online there somewhere, did a study of translation in WeChat. And it's all happening in WeChat, and the Chinese grandmothers are all on WeChat as well. Very, very high-tech community.
Yeah.
Okay, many thanks for your contribution to the discussion, Anthony. I see it's now 10:14. I don't see any more hands being raised, and actually we are on a very tight schedule. And when I say we, I refer to the participants of the CETRA Summer School, because we will now have a 15-minute break, and then we will have a Q&A session. So I think it's best to end the discussion here, so that we can have some fresh air and maybe some caffeine or tea or something to eat, I don't know. And then we will go on. So thank you all. Thank you in the first place, Brian, and all the other participants for listening and for the discussion. And we will meet again. For those who are not enrolled in the summer school, if I'm not mistaken, let me just check. On Monday, with the following lecture by Brian on what translation can do for global sexuality studies. So I expect you to be there in very large numbers. So thank you all and take care.